Greetings, it's Matt, you know, that guy off the Orcs Planet. We've got something different for you tonight. I seem to be saying that a lot in our videos recently, but we're trying out a lot of new things. We've got some new equipment, and I've been wanting to do recordings of the Empire Wiki for the longest time now. So I'm going to start reading the wiki, and hopefully have this as another resource that maybe makes it a little bit more accessible, because I know there's a lot of people that struggle reading vast reams of text. So we'll see how it goes. I certainly know I'm going to enjoy this, and hopefully you lot listening will as well. Hopefully it'll be something that's useful. Linked below are the pages that I have read from. You can go and read them yourself, or even follow along if you like. So without further ado, I am going to start reading directly from the Empire LRP Wiki. Tonight I am going to share with you the tale of the foundation of our empire. Imperial historians date from the foundation of the empire. Events that happened after the empire is created are recorded as YE, for Year of the Empire, and BE, for Before the Empire. Most nations had their own calendars before the foundation of the empire, so historical documents that predate the empire use different systems. A very few highborn historians stubbornly cling to the numbering SL for since landfall, dating from the point at which they first set foot on these shores. But that is a largely discredited system. Before history. Between the creation of the world and the first records of human civilization, an unknown period passes. Some historians speak in terms of eons, others in terms of millennia. Most agree that there was a time before the existence of humans and orcs, when the world may have been dominated by other species, perhaps the dragons whose bones are such a valuable material. This period, and the period that follows it, are sometimes called the Dark Ages, before the illumination of history. Ancient. This period begins with the earliest recorded human habitation of the Bay of Katazar. It starts perhaps as long as 2,000 years ago, before the founding of the empire. The ruins of the first orc and human settlements date from this period. There is some argument amongst imperial scholars as to who was here first, the orcs or the humans. Very little is known for sure about this ancient period, meaning that along with the time before history, it is sometimes called the Dark Ages. According to historians among the Navarre, Urizen and Winterfolk, the Orcs occupied the land that had once belonged to early human kingdoms. What is known is that there were some powerful human kingdoms at this time, but that they were ultimately defeated and overthrown by the Orcs. At some point during this period, the forebears of the Suak, Calavesi, Ushka, Urizen, Tarunial and Feni settled around the bay and began to build their cultures. There are ruins in many other places around the world that date from this period. The Assaveans claim that the city of Nemoria was founded during this period, making it the oldest city in the world. Tarunial. At its height, the Tarunial Empire may have lasted for between 100 and 300 years. During this period, the Orcs were slowly driven out of the heartlands of what is today the Empire. The Turunial traded and warred with other human cultures. Imperial scholars believe that the Suak, the Calavesi, the Ushka, the Feni, and the Urizen, or their forebears, were all present in some form or another during this time, along with several cultures that no longer exist, about whom we only have fragmentary records, such as the Gwerin Morpha. Turunial culture was centered around their cities. The heart of their empire, the city of Turunial, stood in Brokeliand, while other cities existed in Miaran, Hakinia, Liathhaven, and Thurunin. Some historians believe there were between 2 and 5 other cities, located outside the area that the Empire now controls. Exact information about this period is fragmentary, but it is generally believed that the rulers of Turunial were its magicians. This period ends with the catastrophic fall and the creation of the Valorn. Chaos. After the fall of Turunial, the lands of the Bay of Katazar descended into chaos. Following the calamity, the barbarian Orcs, who had largely been pushed out of the central lands, swept back in. A great many humans were enslaved or killed, and their continued invasions sped the collapse of whatever infrastructure had survived the bane of Turunial. These human cultures who survived were isolated or lived in the places the Orcs were not interested in. The Suak and Calavesa in the northwest, the Ushka in the northeast, and the Urizen in the southeast. Some historians believe that it was during the latter part of this period that the Vard and the Steiner fell from the heavens, and encountered respectively the people who would later form Wintermark and Varushka. Regardless, the chaos is generally considered to end with the arrival of the Highborn. Imperial histories tend to place the founding of Nemoria and the city that would become the Sarkovan Delves during this period, despite the claims of foreign scholars to the contrary. Pre-Imperial. 3 waves of colonization brought people that founded new human nations. The Highborn are generally held to be the first, landing in the south, while the forebears of Dawn and the Marchers settled in the east. Some scholars suggest that the Steiner and Vard appeared in the north during this period, after the foundation of Highgard, but there is no true consensus one way or another. When the first waves of human colonization began, most of the initial inhabitants, sometimes called the people of the north, were in retreat. The Navarre to their forests, the Urizen to their mountains, the Suak and the Calavesi to their inhospitable north. The Ushka huddled around their campfires, and the Feni lurked in their wilderness. There were also humans living amongst the other Orcs, largely as chattel, slaves or subjects. Where these humans were freed from Orc oppression, they were usually assimilated by the conquerors, leaving no records of their culture. These nations grew in size and power through constant warfare with their neighbours, particularly the barbarian Orcs who claimed the land as their own. Whilst the nations were successful, Life was hard and brutal for the initial settlers, and historians believe that it was only a matter of time before these new human nations would have been overrun and subjugated like their predecessors. Foundation. Year 0. With an eye to the conflict between the human nations and the risks posed by orcs, the First Empress began her crusade in Highgard. She gathered around a small group of like-minded individuals from various nations, and with their assistance, and with the aid of the Navarre, she brought together the leaders of humanity to discuss the barbarian threat. Her vision and charisma, and the work of her allies, convinced many of them to recognize the value of an empire. The people of Urizen declined to join, but sufficient folk from the Brass Coast, Dawn, Highgard, the League, the Marches, Navarre, Varushka, and Wintermark accepted the proposal to allow them to form the Empire. 1 YE to 5 YE. Internal conflict. In the early years, the Empire concentrated on consolidating its position. The creation of the Empire led to a brief but bloody civil war in the Marches, and the first of many battles with the Orcs. During this time, the first egregores were created through a ritual created by the Hakama of the Brass Coast to ensure that the various nations are able to maintain their distinct cultural identity. The most significant conflict was in Varushka, where the imperial forces engaged those of the corrupt boyar Alderai the Fair, who threatened to conquer Varushka and create his own corrupt empire. With the magical aid of the Volodny magicians, his armies proved to be a match for the imperial forces. The efforts of powerful magicians ultimately neutralized the Volodny, and the tyrant boyar was defeated by the Marcher general Tom Drake, although his body was never recovered. 6 YE. The Senate, the Synod, and the Military Council. The Empress and her advisors laid the groundwork for imperial structures to support and empower the Empire. Building on traditions of government in Wintermark, the Senate was created to advise the Empress and give the nations a voice in the rule of the Empire. Following a plan developed in the Marches, the Military Council of Generals was set up to coordinate the military forces of the various nations. The Synod was formed by the priests of Highgard, allowing the imperial faith to serve as a unifying force, with a remit to ensure that the leaders of the Empire did not become corrupt. 22 YE. Death of the First Empress. The First Empress led her troops from the front, rallying and inspiring them in their campaigns against their enemies. She died on campaign in battle against an Orc barbarian tribe on the Brass Coast, who were subsequently wiped out. She was interred in the necropolis at Highgard, creating the tradition for many dead emperors and empresses that followed. The last known horse, the mount of the First Empress, died at this time. Highgard tales described the pair's final battle, but Urizen records of army logistics from this period suggest that the horse died before the Empress. Although the First Empress is always shown on a horse, there were no more horses after this time. that concludes this evening's readings. Thank you so much for listening and joining me, and I hope that, should these be of interest and use to many people, then I shall continue the series and talk for many more hours about the Empire, the history, and all the events that have happened that leads to the events we have in Anvil. I'm not entirely sure how much of the wiki I'm going to read or where I will stop, but as I started with Imperial history, I shall read up until our last Empress, and then go from there, see where it takes us. If you've got any thoughts or feelings as to what you would like to hear read out, then do let me know in the comments. My only intention for these readings are that they come direct from the wiki, because it is all common knowledge that most Imperial citizens will learn before or around their citizenship test. My hope is that this will become just another resource to make the wiki more accessible to as many people as possible, so that you don't have to read reams and reams of text if you're unable to. And I'm sure that this will become a large, varied conglomeration of readings. Thank you very much again for listening. I hope you did enjoy. And as always, I'll see you another day. Goodbye.